Thank you. And I'm very sorry for the rush. We're on fall break and I'm traveling today, so I apologize for that. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Just a little bit about myself. I am a law professor who writes about banking, credit policies, and otherwise. I have no personal history connected to the truths that I will reveal. I'm actually an immigrant to America, and so I'm coming from this from a research angle, and so I submit my testimony in that light. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, the Black community owned less than 1% of the United States total wealth. More than 150 years later, that number has barely budged. The gap between average white wealth and Black wealth has increased over the last decades. Today, across every socioeconomic level, Black families have a fraction of the wealth of white families. And this wealth chasm doesn't abate with income or with education. In other words, this is a wealth gap that is very much tied to a history of exclusion and exploitation, and not to be remedied by higher education or higher income. Without targeted policies to close this wealth chasm, it will continue to grow. And I want to be clear about how this racial wealth gap was created. It was created, maintained, and perpetuated through public policy at the federal, state, and local level, laws, policies, contracts, and the lack of protection of Black communities' property by the law, the enforced segregation by the federal and state bureaucracies that created a race-based bifurcated economy, created this historic racial wealth gap that self-perpetuates today without any necessity for added inputs. Black men and women have been shut out of most avenues of middle-class wealth creation. Black homes, farms, and savings were not given the full protection of the law, even as these properties were subject to racial terrorism. In employment, education, housing, farm loans, even patent rights, racist policies and practices have either shut Black communities out of the market entirely or offered them separate and subpar services. And this is despite Black banks, Black businesses, and Black communities having engaged in 150 years, if not longer, under brutal and hostile legal conditions to try entrepreneurship and self-help and coordination. The American middle class, however, was not created that way. It was not created through self-help and pull yourself up by bootstrapism. It was created principally through government-supported credit infrastructure that didn't cross the red lines the policymakers drew around Black neighborhoods. You can look today across California, in Los Angeles area, in the Fresno area, in the San Diego area, and San Francisco, and look at the initial red line maps that were created for those areas. And it will say explicitly on those red line maps that this is a neighborhood, with Black people, with these subversive races. Sometimes they talk about racial, inharmonious racial mix. And those red lines were drawn around those communities. And for the next almost 80 years, no public subsidized credit, neither mortgage credit or consumer credit, would pass through those red lines. These very same red line communities were then targeted with the most toxic loans during the subprime crisis. And with the blow up of the subprime crisis, the Black community lost another 53% of its wealth. This time, there were no federal guarantees. These communities have yet to recover from the blow when they were hit yet again with the devastation of the COVID crisis and the unequal distribution of the PPP loans. This is a system that can accurately be described, and I have written an article with this name, that it is a Jim Crow credit and capital system. It is separate and unequal. And many of these discriminatory policies of de jure exclusion have thankfully been explicitly abandoned. Yet the racial wealth gap remains because the damaging effects of these policies have never been directly remedied or counteracted. The wealth gap that those red lines put into motion continues and will continue unless it is disrupted by the same policymakers, namely the US Congress, state Congresses, and regulators that oversee these bureaucracies. In order, or public services, I should say, in order to achieve true racial equity, we must reckon with the fruits of our nation's history. In fact, I believe that it is the myths that we tell about our history and the economy that present the biggest hurdles to achieving economic justice. myths that blame those who were the targets of discrimination for disparities they did not create, and myths that offer personal responsibility instead of justice. In my work, I've tried to debunk two of these myths in particular. One, the myth of self-help finance as an avenue to wealth creation. I call this the George Bailey myth of the famous movie. And two is the myth of personal decision-making, the bootstrap myth. There are no amount of individual spending and savings decisions, no amount of lattes, avocado toast, or sneakers foregone, as public policymakers would advise, and no amount of hours worked that can counteract the forceful headwinds of historic policies. People do work hard, and people do make hard financial decisions, and yet they still face the legacies of racist policies in segregated schools, neighborhoods, and access to mobility. No matter what the family structure, the wealth gap exists. Black and white families who do everything, quote unquote, the right way, as some people on the right would say, get married, get an education, buy a home, start a business, save their money, and still the wealth gap persists. In fact, this gap is highest at the very top of the income and education ladder. So this is not caused by any personal decisions or cultural decisions, as a lot of racist explanations have offered over the last 100 years. And just to be clear, investing, working hard, getting an education, starting a business are all great things to do. And my point is not that these things aren't worth doing, it is that they have been done for centuries. From investing hard-earned wages into the Freedmen's Bank, to marching for jobs, to taking out a mortgage, these prudent financial decisions were often taken amidst a history of exclusion, exploitation, violence, and virulent racism. And quite frankly, outright land theft in California specifically. Black institutions have been creative and innovative in serving their communities in a hostile climate. I've written a book about the long history of entrepreneurship, self-help, and mutual uplift. HBCUs have provided stellar educations. Black banks have lent to Black businesses, churches, and families. They have offered credit where the FHA refused to guarantee loans. And Black families have invested in these homes at great personal cost. Their homes are valued less because they are in Black neighborhoods. This racial gap in home values is just one example of the tangible present effects of a history of exclusion. And the racial wealth gap is where past injustice breeds present suffering. In order to move forward, we must make public policy that disrupt the patterns that sustain disparities in wealth. For it is obvious, stated Dr. Martin Luther King, that if a man is entering the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, he would have to perform some impossible feat in order to catch up with his fellow runner. The racial wealth gap was created by exclusionary policies coordinated across the branches of government. It was created systematically through taxation, banking, housing laws, private markets sustained by federal subsidies. And this is exactly the level of holistic coordination across governmental agencies, federal, state, and local, that is necessary to close the racial wealth gap. President Biden recently said that we need to make the issue of racial equity not just an issue for any one department of government. It has to be the business of the whole government. And I, written testimonies I've written and other books, I've suggested several steps that can be taken to aimed at various sectors of the economy. And these efforts should be coordinated, tracked, and measured across governmental agencies through a dedicated task force for the sole purpose of closing the racial wealth gap. Policies must provide a meaningful path to capital creation, access to low-cost credit, financial inclusion, tax justice, and home ownership grants. In other words, the same programs provided to white families over the last century. And I want to be clear about this. Nothing short of a full reparations can meet the scale of the harm done. And even then, the harms are not fully remedied. They will not be remedied with as much money as we can use to remedy just the monetary benefits, because what remains are the psychological, the trauma of being subjects of terrorism historically and having those properties removed. Real reforms, however, require that we look directly at this history. We must design a holistic remedy with a singular mission to achieve the promises of justice and equality in our nation's constitution that we promised each other. And I will conclude again with the words of President Biden, because this is the current administration, that it's time to act now, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because if we do, we'll all be better off for it. I appreciate the testimony. I'm here for questions of any kind. Thank you very much.